been surprised by the number of questions that I've gotten after my first major video that I put out. So I've decided to launch a probably monthly, perhaps later on, more often Q&A. And as the title card suggests, that will be after hours in the Armory with myself, of course, answering questions from the viewers. And at this point, we'll go ahead and get into the questions that we've received. These questions have mostly been taken from the M39 Physica PH sniper rifle video, as well as some other questions sent to me since its release.
Matt Falk 6621 asks a two-part question. Given its growing pains, how many stock variations did the M27 have? There are sources stating that the Finnish Army sent a number of M27s to the Civil Guard. Is this true? And what did the transition entail of M39s from straight stock and Puolustuslaitos variant to the more commonly produced variants after that? Answering in sequential order, the Finnish Mosin Nagant M27 rifle had no fewer than 8 distinct stock variations. The initial production of the M27 involved the Finnish Army refitting existing Mosin-Nagant M91 stocks by cutting them down and adding a sling swivel on the buttstock. These come in 3 varieties: stocks with the intact sling slot and the sling swivel, which are the rarest; stocks with a regular rectangular wooden patch over the sling slot and the sling swivel, the next rarest; stocks with an oval wooden patch over the sling slot and the sling swivel, which are the most common. Later on, the Finnish Army used imported wood from Germany that did not have a sling slot or a splice, but did still retain the sling swivel. After 1934, the Finnish Army refitted existing stocks with new front halves due to weaknesses with the M27 stock's design. These stocks usually, but not always, incorporated a new nose cap with the so-called popsicle stick metal reinforcement tabs on each side. The Finnish Army also began procurement of a purpose-built, heavier stock for the M27 rifle later in the 1930s. These stocks retain the sling swivel but will never have brass unit identification discs. During World War II, the Finnish Army placed M27 rifles into modified M9130 stocks due to a shortage of spare stocks. These will never have the added sling swivel on them. After World War II, the Finnish Army created a universal replacement stock for the M27, M28, and M2830 rifles. These stocks will never have the sling swivel and can be found both with and without the redesigned nose cap. So, there you go, 8 different M27 stock types. There are some other sub-varieties too, but nothing worth mentioning here. As for the Civil Guard M27 rifles, the Finnish Ministry of Defense gave permission to the Finnish Defense Forces to give approximately 2,000 M27 rifles from various military depots to the Civil Guard in early 1939. How many the Army actually transferred is unknown, and I personally have only seen 2 M27 rifles with verified Civil Guard markings on them, so it can be assumed that they're fairly uncommon or rare. As for the M39 stocks and their transition from the straight stock to the pistol grip stock, as well as the Puolustuslaitos marking, this one is a bit more nuanced. SACO, upon receiving the first order for 20,000 M39 rifles, used approximately 7,000 pre-existing stock blanks that were already sawn and partially turned into a semi-finished state and lacked the semi-pistol grip that the Finnish Army desired. This was from a desire to get rifles into the hands of troops as quickly as possible, and the Finnish Army agreed to accept no more than this initial order with the straight stocks. Straight stock is not an official term. It's more of a collector term that denotes the M39 stocks that don't have pistol grips. SACO used approximately 6,000 of these straight stocks on their 1941 dated barrels, and any unused examples were later used as replacement components on other stocks. So occasionally you'll see SACO M39s with dates later than 1941 that have straight stocks on them, or VKT or other types of M39 barrels with straight stocks. As for the Puolustuslaitos marking, this was a short-lived property marking used by the Finnish Army in the spring of 1941. Puolustuslaitos literally means Defense Department in Finnish, and this marking was used as a property marking before the advent of the boxed Suomen Armeija marking, the SA stamp, later on. The Puolustuslaitos range on SACO M39 rifles runs from approximately 204,000 to 209,000, with the far outliers being 200,128 and 209,865. Alex Brasco 8619 asks, Where did they come from? Why did the Finns use them? How did the Finnish Mosin Nagants compare to the Russians? Well, it's a pretty complex question. It's going to take a little while to unpack. I'll try to do it as succinctly and briefly as I can, but it's going to take a minute and probably warrants its own special video later on. As for the where did they come from, as an aside, most of the following information is drawn from my book, The Finnish Mosin Nagant 3-Line Rifle, the Ukko-Pekka, specifically Chapter 5, Domestic Expansion and International Acquisitions, 1918 to 1939, and Chapter 16, War Booty, White Elephants, Imported Weaponry, and Unlicensed Copies. This book is available for sale in the link in the description below through Wet Dog Publications. Every copy comes autographed by myself, the author. So contrary to popular belief, not every Finnish used Mosin-Nagant as a captured example. Shortly after achieving independence, the Finnish army held 201,615 Mosin-Nagant rifles of various types in their arsenals. These rifles mostly came from inherited Russian stockpiles, although the German army also provided thousands of rifles to the Finnish White Guards during the build-up to the Finnish War of Independence and during the conflict proper. The Finns augmented these rifles through a series of international arms purchases during the 1920s. Initially, the Finnish Ministry of Defense attempted to do this on their own, but later on worked with some partners. One of their first deals they made was with Poland in 1924, in which they obtained 2,151 M91 Dragoon rifles in exchange for various German equipment left over from World War I. Maxim machine guns, 5,420 K98A carbines, 934 G98 rifles, and a whole bunch of German Mauser bayonets. A couple years later, Finnish Captain Salarenta, commander of the Military Equipment Department, later of LS-26 light machine gun and the P-Series fame, led a purchase commission to Italy to purchase Mosin-Nagant rifles and components that the Italians either captured from the Austro-Hungarians during World War I or received as war reparations thereafter. There was an agreement for about 40,000 Russian rifles that were going to go to Finland at a price of 75 Italian lira per piece. These included 33,260 complete M91 rifles, 6,620 M91 rifles without bolts, 589 non-functional rifles, 2,298 complete M91 Dragoon rifles, and 506 M91 Dragoon rifles without bolts. Another early success was the importation of rifles through Albania using a German firm called Benny Spiro, which is a Hamburg-based trading company in which excess Asevarikko rifles were sent to Albania in exchange for Mosin-Nagants. Benny Spiro functioned as an international arms dealer and provided the Finns with either hard currency or Mosin-Nagant rifles in return for unwanted Finnish armaments. In this case, the unwanted material consisted of a mixed bag of Asevarikko Type 30, Type 35, and Type 38 models held in Finnish Army arsenals. Operating under this understanding, a final trade agreement signed in January of 1928, by which the Finnish Ministry of Defense handed over the following wares to Benny Spiro for further export to Albania: 5,600 Asevarikko rifles in working order, 2,570 non-functional but repairable Asevarikko rifles, 4,800 Asevarikko Type 30 bayonets, 11 million 6.5 millimeter cartridges, and an unspecified but large amount of various spare parts. In return, the Finnish Ministry of Defense received 13,000 fully functional Mosin-Nagant rifles, complete with bayonets. Although they were encouraged by their initial success, the Finnish Ministry of Defense desired a trading partner based out of Finland who shared similar national interests. In 1927, the Military Equipment Department, acting on behalf of the Finnish Ministry of Defense, entered into an agreement with the international trading company Oy Transbaltic AB, which operated out of Helsinki. In their first discussions with their representatives, the Military Equipment Department expressed their interest in acquiring Russian military equipment through the trade and sale of surplus equipment held by the Finnish Defense Forces. The Finnish Army's arsenals required large quantities of receivers, bolts, and magazines for their initial production of the M27 rifle, which was about to start at that time. None of these parts could be produced in Finland, so the assistance of Transbaltic AB in obtaining them was considered essential. The Finnish Military Equipment Department worked with them to scour neglected armament depots around Europe for surplus Mosin-Nagant rifles and parts. These exploits probably warrant their own video, but the chart below, you can see some of the deals made both by the Finnish Ministry of Defense and later Oitran's Baltic Ob throughout Europe and the amount of rifles that they obtained. It should be important to note that all of these were purchased or essentially traded for. None of these are Finnish captured. Everyone loves to throw around the words Finnish captured whenever they see an SA marking on anything. However, by 1939, Trans-Baltic Ob had vacuumed up most of the available European sources of Mosin-Nagant rifles left in usable condition. With storm clouds gathering over Europe and another major war on the way, any remaining rifles were being held as war reserves at that point rather than being offered for sale to Finland. There were a couple of minor deals that were made later on in 1940 and 1941, but these rifles were of lesser value and mostly broken up for parts. Why did the Finns use them? Well, the Finnish army and the civil guard used the Mosin-Nagant rifle more due to necessity than anything else. This happened for the simple reason it was clearly the most common type existing in Finnish service, and there wasn't any funding for new rifles in any significant quantities. The number of rifles held by the Finnish military, according to their first comprehensive inventory from February of 1919, is pretty illustrative of this. If you look at the chart below, the Mosin-Nagant was by far the most common rifle in Finnish service at that point, with a total of 201,615 examples being held across the various arsenals and branches of service. The next most common were variants of the Asevarikko, which would stay in service initially with the Finnish Army and later the Civil Guard up until the late 1920s. There was a number of Winchester Model 1895s and 7.62 Russian that were also held. And lastly, the miscellaneous category that comprised 12,332 rifles configured in a variety of various types. Mausers, Mannlichers, Swedish Mausers, and everything else in between. Relatively early on, the Russian M91 infantry rifle was standardized in Finnish service, specifically in August of 1918. The Finns captured and inherited relatively large numbers of these in comparison to the M91 Dragoon and Cossack models. Those models saw limited use besides a few thousand that the Finnish army modified as the M91 RV for their cavalry troopers. The M1907 carbine was captured in such small numbers, no more than a few dozen, that it never received a standardized nomenclature in Finnish service and saw limited issue as a non-standard weapon during the early days of Finnish independence before permanent removal from service. Despite the Finnish Army's desire to adopt the Mauser variant, the Finnish government simply didn't possess the funds to do so during the 1920s. This led to early stopgap models such as the M27 and M28 before giving way to the more comprehensive rebuilds like the M2830 and M39 rifles. Despite a series of prototype semi-automatic rifles during the 1930s, such as the Pello and Ladi models, the Finns didn't make any serious attempts at the adaptation or adoption of such a model. After the Winter War, Sacco did experiment with domestically copying and producing the Soviet Tokarev SVT-38 rifle. However, once again, Finland possessed neither the industry, funding, or time to make this a reality. Finland would later begin a movement away from Mosin-Nagant-derived designs, although this wouldn't happen until the 1950s when they reverse-engineered the AK-47 design to create the RK-62 assault rifle, but that's a story for another time. How did the Finnish Mosin-Nagants compare to the Russian examples? Well, this one's probably going to upset a lot of collectors, but Finnish Mosin-Nagants are generally considered superior to their Russian counterparts, and based solely upon my opinion, here's a breakdown of some of the key differences. In terms of quality and craftsmanship, yes, the Finns used Russian receivers and a number of Russian components and parts, chiefly bolts and magazines, but they made new barrels and other parts to much finer tolerances than the Russians did, and they even comprehensively rebuilt some captured Russian examples, mostly M9130 rifles with new stocks and triggers while retaining the barreled actions. In comparison, when Ivan is told to make rifles or go to the gulag, Ivan makes more rifles, quality being irrelevant at times. In particular, the Soviet-produced examples from during World War II, those made after 1941 and before 1945, have pretty severe variations in quality, barrel diameter, and general finish, although they're all generally functional, will go bang when you pull the trigger. In terms of accuracy, Finnish rifles have much tighter tolerances and superior barrels, better triggers. This is going to result in better accuracy, especially at longer ranges. I'm not saying that Russian rifles can't be accurate. In particular, the barrels selected by the Russians for accuracy that were later used, although not always, in sniper rifle production generally hold their own. In terms of features, the Finns did things that the Russians and Soviets never did. I mean, look at an M39, it's got a pistol grip. You won't see that on any Russian variation of the Mosin-Nagant. As well as triggers. The Finns used smoother and lighter triggers. In particular, the M27 and M39 have excellent two-stage triggers. Russian rifles, your trigger can be a little heavy and gritty at times, and the Russian refurbishment methods that happened after World War II didn't help anything. Overall, in terms of collectability and desirability, generally speaking, a Finnish variant of anything, if you call it an M91, M9130, or any of the other Finnish variants such as the M27, M28, M39, M2830, are all going to be more desirable, and less common, and more valuable than their Russian counterparts. This is just a simple fact of life because there were a lot fewer of them made. The Finns made fewer than 100,000 M39 rifles. The Russians made 7 million M9130s during World War II. It's not really comparable at that point. There are rare Russian variations. There's more common Finnish variations. But at the end of the day, if I had to choose between the two of them, I'd pick a Finn. Quantum Blade 5571 asks, would you be willing to perhaps film a range day with it? He is, of course, referring to the M39 Physica PH sniper rifle that I filmed my previous video on. And unfortunately, the answer is no. This is where serious collectors have to consider historical preservation over the potential enjoyment of what could be gained from shooting such a piece. Some of the things I keep in mind are the following. What are the chances of a component of the firearm breaking? In this case, the Physica scope was notoriously fragile during World War II. 80 years later, it really hasn't improved any. Additionally, the unique stock at the M39PH would be nearly irreplaceable. If I fired it and I cracked the wrist or broke it in any other way, if I did break a component of the firearm, would I be able to replace it? What would the potential cost involved be? I'll put it this way. The Physica scope on my M39PH cost twice as much as the rifle itself, and the rifle itself wasn't cheap. So based upon these concerns, I have thus far erred on the side of caution. Finding another M39PH would be nearly impossible. It took me a decade plus of collecting to find the rifle I have right now, and another couple years to find the accompanying Physica scope. Though it'd be fun to see how accurate it was at the range, I'm just not a big fan of taking a chance of breaking something on that. I know it might break some of y'all's hearts out there, but at the end of the day, that's just the choice that I've made. Commies and Mums asks, if you could only keep one rifle in your collection, which one would it be? Why that one? Well, as tempted as I am to answer my M39PH that was in my previous video, it's not actually my favorite rifle. My favorite Finnish rifle that I have in my collection is probably one of my M27 RV cavalry rifles. These rifles lived a hard life, and it really shows in how they look today. And with the few surviving examples that are still around, they're typically beat to absolute garbage, and they look the part. This one in particular has got damage in the wrist. It's got a handguard that was damaged. It's got all sorts of chunks missing out of it. The bolts mismatched. It's an ugly rifle. But at the same time, I know the history of these rifles. There were two Finnish cavalry regiments that existed before World War II, and they were the Uusimaa and the Häme cavalry regiments. These two units later on formed the Finnish Cavalry Brigade, which kind of got used like a firefighting brigade, and firefighting meaning they go to the section of the front that's the hottest throughout the Winter War and then the Continuation War. And although there are only a couple of thousand M27 RV rifles built in the first place, and note they're rifles, they're not carbines. Everyone calls them a carbine. They're a rifle, at least in Finnish parlance, and they're about the same length as an M1 Garand, and I'll do a video on these in the future. but they were used very, very frequently where the fighting was the thickest, and as a result, not a lot of these rifles survived. By the end of the war, most of them were unserviceable. There were a few hundred left in Finnish arsenals, and when Interarmco, Sam Cummings, of course, buys off the rest of them in 1959 from the Finnish Ministry of Defense, there's 304 that he gets. What the exact breakdown is, how many were prototypes, how many were production variants, that's unknown. But he gets 304 in 1959. Those are imported to the United States. This actually takes most of them out of Finland. There's a handful of M27 RV rifles still left in Finland, but most of those ones are put together from parts, with a few that are in museums that are likely original. So one of those cases where if they'd really known what they were exporting, they might have kept some more of them, at least the really nice, decent examples. So if I had to pick one, it'd probably be this one. Nice 1933 dated example. You can see it up on the screen now. Not my, go-to rifle to take to the range, but from a historian standpoint and from a survivor standpoint, definitely my favorite. The @Milsert Mike channel asks, since I believe you said you've learned the language, we could use some good phonetic pronunciations, i.e. Puolustuslaitos, Asevarikko, what SAT and VKT stand for, etc. Well, Mike, I would hesitate to think I could ever speak as fluently as a native Finn, but knowing the language is very helpful when translating documents. Took 4 years of Arabic in college and stayed at the Arab Language Institute in Cairo. While Finnish isn't quite that hard, it's not that far off either. Minä puhun vähän suomea, se on todella vaikea kieli. Basically, I speak a little bit of Finnish, but it's a really difficult language. The best thing to do with Finnish, and I am not a language instructor, let me caveat that, is to sound it out phonetically. Finnish is both very simple and very complicated at the same time. There are no trick sounds or silent letters. For example, with English, there are words like pneumonia, in which the P is silent. That doesn't happen in Finnish. Additionally, there are letters in the English language like S and C that can sound exactly the same based upon a word. For example, the word city sounds like an S to an outside person who hasn't spoken English previously. Finnish generally avoids these pitfalls. However, slight intonations in words, which are easily recognizable to native speakers, can make a big difference. One word can possess multiple meanings as well. For example, Finnish is a great language. Let's pick some phrases here. The spruce is on fire. Kuusipala. The spruce returns. Also, kuusipala. The number 6 is on fire. The number 6 returns. 6 of them are on fire. 6 of them return. Your moon is on fire. Your moon returns. 6 pieces. Once again, all kuusipala. If there's a double syllable, you really have to stress it. Failure to do so results in the speaker saying things they didn't intend to. For example, if I said kusipala instead of kuusipala, then it would have meant the P is burning, but you can substitute another word for P because no demonetization for me today, even if I don't have nearly enough followers. Anyways, now that we've had a little Finnish primer, let's get on to your question. Puolustuslaitos. So Finnish combines words, and kind of like German. So here we have puolustus in laitos, literally defense and establishment or department, defense department. This marking is found on a small percentage of Mosin-Nagant rifles and other Finnish Army property, marked in early 1942. This marking was only used for a couple months as a property marking. It's fairly uncommon and usually results in a more desirable Mosin-Nagant or other item. I've seen it on some Finnish pistols as well. Asevarikko is simple enough, with the ase referring to weapons and the varikko meaning depot, and in other words, an armory. Finnish abbreviations Asevarikko is referred to by the letters AV with a number at the end denoting the location. For example, Asevarikko Uksi, AV1, was in Helsinki prior to World War II. The Finnish Army initially possessed 3 armories and eventually expanded to 9 during World War II before contracting down to just 2 during the Cold War, AV1 and AV3. As for VKT, Well, that's Valtion Kivari Tehedas. Valtion refers to the state. Kivari is rifle, and Tehedas is factory. So literally state rifle factory. Granted, the state rifle factory of Finland made more than just rifles. VKT stood up to build the M26, sometimes called the LS-26 or the Lahti Salarenta 26, the light machine gun that they began to make in 1926. It expanded beyond that. It made M27 rifles during the 1930s, later made M39 and M91 barrels. It made the Lahti L35 pistol, made a number of other small arms products, tools, parts. It existed in its original form till 1946 when it became Valtion Metaltehat, or the state metal plant, before becoming Valmet in 1951. Finally, Valmet's firearms division was merged with Sako to form Sako Valmet Oy in 1986, and later that company was sold to the Italian Beretta Holding Group in 2000. Moving on, SAT. All right, well, I'm going to botch this one, so all my Finnish listeners out there, I'm about to mess this up. I'm going to do my best. Soilmen ampumetarvikkehedas. SAT is essentially a Finnish ammunition factory. They built a meager initial run of M91 rifles in the early 1920s at their plant in Riihimäki. You can read about this in chapter 6 of my book. There's a couple pictures in there as well. These are very, very rare M91s. There's only a handful of them still in existence, 8 to be exact, with only a couple of those being located in the United States. This run was seen as a failure. SAT went out of business very quickly by 1924. They no longer existed. However, their derelict and defunct factory was purchased by the Civil Guard in 1927, moved their main Civil Guard workshop there, which would become Sako, to that location. And that's probably a story for another time. So apologies to all my Finnish listeners. I've been learning Finnish for close to half a decade, and I'm still not much more fluent than a second or a third grader. I can read it a lot better than I speak it. Thank you, Mike, for making me look like an idiot. I really enjoyed that, but I did my best. Great questions, by the way. James M. 1297 asks, great video. Watching this about the universal scope made me think about the U.S. using a commercial scope and mount for World War II snipers. So, hypothetical question. Let's say there's an alternate universe and the U.S. wanted to adopt the Mosin-Nagant over the M1903. What Mosin-Nagant model would suit U.S. needs, and what features from different Mosin-Nagants would the U.S. use? Well, that's an interesting question, James. First, alluding to the first part of what you said, yes, the Weaver scopes the U.S. adapted for the M1903A4 during World War II were pretty crappy and right up there with the same durability level as the Finnish Physica scopes, if not worse. Moving on to the second part of your question/statement, alternate universe. So I'm a little bit of a historian, and if you're going to go back to when the U.S. adopted the M1903, that really comes down to a couple of factors. The U.S. Army was armed with the Krag, while the Navy and the Marines used the Remington Lee and the Lee Model 1895. And the M1903 replaced all of these models in service, mostly as a result of fighting the Spanish during the 1898 Spanish-American War. Specifically during the Battle of San Juan Hill, a force of about 750 Spanish troops fought well above their weight class because they were equipped with charger-loading Mauser Model 1893 rifles, thoroughly outshot the U.S. troops who had Springfield Krag Jorgensens and older model Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor rifles. Higher rate of fire, higher muzzle velocity, smokeless powder. These were all things the U.S. was looking for, and the Krag just could not be modified enough to get to that point, which is why we ended up copying a Mauser design, we being the U.S. Army, and going that direction. However, alternate universe, alternate timeline, everything else, let's say the U.S. government really wanted to adopt the Mosin-Nagant. Well, no one wanted to adopt the Mosin-Nagant at that point in history besides the Russian army. The problem here is the U.S. Army wanted a shorter universal weapon. Springfield M1903 has a 24-inch barrel on it, I believe. That was keeping with trends at the time for a universal rifle. You look at something like the Swiss, the model 1911 carabiner rifle, or the British with a short magazine Lee Enfield. There was already a trend at the turn of the 20th century. World War I would show that was the correct trend, in which the overall length of rifles was not seen to be needed to be so long. You think of the Gewehr 98, the Mosin-Nagant M91, the Italian Carcano model 1891. All of these rifles have very, very long barrel lengths and overall lengths. For example, the Mosin-Nagant M91 is 51 and a half inches long. That's over 4 feet. That's a very, very long, ungainly rifle. The problem here is that even the shorter variants that existed that time in the early 20th century of the Mosin-Nagant, chiefly the Dragoon and Cossack models, which are more or less exactly the same, except the matter of how they were sighted in with and without a bayonet, aren't that much shorter. They're 48.75 inches long, overall length. In reality, if the U.S., in this hypothetical or alternate universe, was to adopt a Mosin-Nagant model, it would probably want one of those or an even shorter model, which there existed in prototype form, but the Russians never adopted. So it would have to be something shorter. One of the other requirements for the M1903 was that it needed a stripper clip or a charger clip. Well, we can check that block for the Mosin-Nagant, although anyone that's used some of them knows sometimes you might get rim lock or other issues. It's not exactly the world's most user-intuitive design right there. Additionally, the U.S. Army really liked their knife-type bayonets. There's a famous story about Teddy Roosevelt using the initial ramrod bayonet on the M1903 and being disgusted with how flimsy it was. The Mosin-Nagant would have likely needed to be modified to have a knife or a sword-type bayonet. You look at what the Finns did with their models, or you look at some of the Russian prototype models that they made just prior to World War I or the ones prior to World War II as well. Those incorporated knife-type bayonets. So I think at a bare minimum, you're looking the shortest possible model, so a Dragoon, likely fitted with the charger clip that it originally would have had, additionally having some kind of knife bayonet. So really, later on what the Finnish came up with, something about the length of the M27 RV cavalry rifle is actually about the same length as a 1903. They're off by about an inch. I'll have to do a comparison video between the two of them. So I would say, yeah, we're looking at something like an M27 RV for the U.S. Army instead of an M1903, if that had been possible in this alternate timeline in the early 20th century. So thanks for the question. At Christian Smithson 2304 asks, it would be interesting to hear more about Finnish use of captured M44 Mosin-Nagants. If at all, I think another interesting topic would be how lessons from World War II affected subsequent small arms development in Finland. Unrelated and just for fun, in the apocalypse, what is the one caliber you use? All and any questions are fair game, no restrictions. Well, let's start off with the question about the Mosin-Nagant carbines. So specifically, if you have my book, Chapter 16, I talk about this a lot in the captured and purchased weaponry. The Finns captured 489 M38 carbines during the Winter War, and an even greater number during the Continuation War, which began in the summer of 1941. However, the total number of Finnish captured M38 and later M44 carbines remained relatively small. When the war ended, the Finns held about 2,291 M38, M44 carbines in storage, and according to a 1951 inventory. However, they scrapped a sizable, although unknown quantity of these before selling the rest to Interarms in the late 1950s. The Finns made no distinction between the two carbine types, and many M44 carbines that came out of Finland are found without bayonet mounts or without the folding integral bayonets on them. Now, whether or not this was done there or later on after they were imported, I don't know, but it is a trend that you see on Finnish captured M44s. Finnish captured M44s are very, very, very uncommon. I know of a couple dozen examples in comparison to hundreds of Finnish marked M38 carbines out there. Either way, the Finns used them in roughly the same manner. They were handy rifles. They were used on patrols. They were used by troops that might not be frontline soldiers. Occasionally, you'll see a picture of a mortar crew or someone else, like this one that I have on the screen right now, using one of them. However, the Finns didn't really like it because of the muzzle flash. It's significant with a shorter barrel. Not all the powder burns off, larger muzzle flash. Some people love to have YouTube videos of them shooting these things. Big burning powder flash. Looks cool. Not really a good thing in combat, though, when you give away your position like that. Additionally, it was not the most accurate of models, and the Finns really, really treasured the accuracy of their rifles. Finnish Mosin Nagants are inherently more accurate than Russian Mosin Nagants just because of the tighter tolerances they were made to, as well as better ammunition. So you're really not taking advantage of those factors. Moving on to your next question, lessons from small arms. So the Finnish army came out of World War II, and they really wanted more automatic weapons. They really wanted an intermediate cartridge. You look at what the Germans did with the Sturmgewehr 44, the MP43, the MP44, whatever you want to call it. The Germans really were pioneers in this regard, and the Finns tried to go that direction after World War II. They made prototypes. They looked at submachine guns. The Soimi M31 had a lot of use by the end of World War II. Greater and greater numbers were in combat to the point where you look at photographs from the 1944 Russian summer offensive, one every 2, 3, 4 Finnish troops has an M31 Soimi instead of a rifle. Automatic weaponry was very, very useful in the later stages of the war. The Red Army also used greater numbers of submachine guns, whether you're talking about the Pepesha 41 or the 43. So you see these things, and the Finns eventually in the 1950s, which probably a video for another time, end up copying the Russians once again. So we've already copied the Mosin-Nagant. We're going to go ahead and copy the AK-47 as well, which becomes initially the RK-60 and then the RK-62. And the Finns continue to use that model today, which during the Cold War gave them ammo commonality with the Russian army in the case of an invasion, and later on just a very, very dependable, sturdy firearm. Granted, the RK-62 has a lot of changes that the original AK did not have and incorporate. It's more accurate. It's better suited for that environment. But once again, another video for another time. Lastly, the question about the ammo cartridge or ammo caliber in the apocalyptic scenario. Well, I'm going to get excommunicated from the Church of Mosin right here, so let's just go ahead and throw up the excommunication meme. I would not use 7.62 by 54R. As much as I enjoy that caliber, it's not that handy if you're really moving around a whole lot. I mean, if you look at a modern firearm that uses that caliber, you're talking something like a PSL or a Dragunov. They're not exactly the handiest firearms to have. In comparison, I probably take something in 5.56. I know that sounds terrible. I've spent a whole career carrying one around in the military, whether it's an M4 or an M16. I'm quite comfortable with it. So yeah, flame me if you want. But my advice to anyone in such a scenario is go with what you know and what you're comfortable with and what you have ammunition for.
Matt Falk 6621 asks, the Finns had a decent amount of M9130s. How many were sourced via German capture, and how are those specific M9130s distinguished? Okay, well, breaking that one down, if you do have a copy of my book, Chapter 15 covers this pretty extensively, the differences between a captured M9130 and ones that the Finns made with Tikkakoski barrels. However, to answer the question specifically, Finland purchased a large quantity of Russian material that the Germans themselves captured in the summer of 1944. This shipment arrived in July of 1944, and in addition to the large items such as a few T-34-76 tanks, the deal included 56,722 miscellaneous Soviet rifles, the majority of which were M9130 rifles. However, the exact quantities aren't known and broken down. These were generally in a very poor condition. A lot of them had been used by German allies in the Baltics or had just sat in German storage for the years in which they were captured. A lot of them were captured in 1941. The Finns did not consider this a total loss, as even parts retain value, and a lot of them were recycled into their own M9130 production that was going on in AV1 and AV3 with the Tikakoski barrels at that time. So somewhere less than 56,000 is probably the accurate number. It couldn't have been more than that for how many they bought from the Germans. In terms of what identifies a German used and then later on Finnish used M9130, there's a few things. The rear sight, whatever reason, the Germans liked to take the bluing off of it and put the rear sight in the white. This was similar to what they did on their own Kar 98K rifles. If the rear sight is in the white, that was likely a German capture, or at least that part was. Same thing with a blued bolt. When the Germans overhauled M9130 rifles and other captured Mosin-Nagants, they blued the bolt. I've seen a blued bolt on a Dragoon that's original to the rifle. Would have went through German hands at some point. And then lastly, the Germans re-serial numbered and stamped new serial numbers on these rifles in places where the Finns didn't. So the Finns, generally speaking, cared about the bolt and the fact that the bolt matched the barrel. Other models, you'll see the floor plate on on M39s, and you'll see the butt plate, last two digits, the serial number on M28s and M2830s. Germans renumbered the floor plate, the bolt, and sometimes the butt plate as well. So you can see all three there. It's usually in a smaller font. They don't include the alphanumeric prefix, so it's not going to have the Russian Cyrillic there. So if you find a renumbered floor plate on a capture 9130, once again, likely a German capture. Now, just to throw it out in comparison for how rare one of these are, the Finns captured almost 150,000 M9130 rifles during the Winter War and later on during the Continuation War. However, these captures really ticked downwards after the end of 1941. In fact, fewer than 8,000 M9130s are captured after 1941, whereas by December of 1941, if you count the Winter War, about 148,000 were captured up till that point in time. Rule of thumb, not necessarily true, but something I've seen in my time as a collector and as an author on this subject. Wartime captures have a higher chance, if they are post-1941, of being German captures for whatever reason. Pre-war captures are generally Finnish. Now, these trends don't hold fast and true. It's just I've observed a number of mid-war examples with wartime barrels. We're talking 42, 43, Asevarikko or Tula barrels that have German marks on them that then also have Finnish marks. Take it for what it's worth. It's entirely anecdotal, but that's my experience there. I hope that answers the question.
Like a Glock asks, are there any records of Russians capturing these rifles and scopes? And by these rifles, he's referring to M27 PH sniper rifles or M39 PH sniper rifles and their requisite physicoscopes. Well, unfortunately, I can't find anything on that, and I haven't. There's very little on what the Soviets did with the rifles they captured from the Finns. By and large, they would have just been stored. Anything that was usable, they would have salvaged it for parts. Common parts, bolts, magazines, things like that can be reused. If it was a common model, like the M91 or the M9130, it would have been put back into circulation. And in truly desperate times, they would have been used by the Russians as well. Soviet Blogspot did a post on this a while back. In fact, they talk about the exact numbers. And the Moscow militia in late 1941 had 8,190 unserviceable Finnish rifles and 2,406 serviceable weapons. How many of those were M27s or M27 physical PHs? It's pre-M39 that the Soviets could have captured. Who's to say, but it's possible one or two of them could have been in there. If you look at the picture that should be on the screen right about now, that's a picture of some Soviet militia with an M2830 rifle. So they did have Finnish rifles. They didn't have a whole lot of them. It seems like anything that was captured was likely kept in use at the front or scrapped and melted down and made into more Soviet M9130s and other weapons. Hope that helps. Rizuskia 6803, sorry, I probably mangled that, asks a two-part question. First part being, what was the purpose of the Mosin-Nagant 7.62x39 experiment in Finland? And part two, what do these original rifles look like?
Well, it's a very, very obscure thing that I did not actually cover in my book. 584 pages was not enough to cover everything. But if you read Markku Palakangas's 3-volume set, the second book in chapter 16, he talks about the conversions. The Finnish army asked Valmet, which is the later successor to VKT, to make a conversion of both the M91 and the M39 from 762 by 54R to 762 by 39 in the late 1950s due to the advent of the Finnish adoption of the AK-47. Initially, they bought them. Later on, they produced them as the RK-62. These two versions were called the M9156, which was the conversion from the M91, and the M3956, which was the conversion from the M39. This was done by shortening the barrel by about 50 centimeters, making the total length of the weapon much handier, and then modifying the bolt head so that it could accept a rimless round rather than a rimmed round. Initially, the project looked like it was going to succeed. There was some momentum. By 1957, they'd come up with a cost estimate, and had been calculated at about 7,500 marks per M91 conversion and 5,000 marks per M39 conversion. This was actually quite reasonable. It was only about a quarter the cost of a new weapon. And additionally, if you've ever been curious about how much money it cost them to convert an M91 to an M39, that cost 18,000 marks, so a little bit more than double what this conversion would have been. However, this kind of stalled out by the end of 1957, and ultimately the Finnish army, despite a number of prototypes, decided not to go forward with the conversions of the old rifles. One of the larger reasons was actually the stocks of 7.62 by 54R were quite sufficient. They had plenty, including what they captured from the Red Army during World War II. Additionally, the stripper clips, or the chargers, could not be modified for the rimless round from the rimmed round, which was also seen as a problem. And pretty soon, Valmet and Sacco were both going to be tooled up enough to produce the RK-62 in numbers. It was decided just to keep the M39 in inventory and the M91 in deep depot level storage without converting them. It does make a fascinating what if. I'd love to handle one of these. I've never had the chance to. They look quite handy, and apparently they actually shot quite well as well. That's going to be it for this Q&A session. Thank you, everybody, for joining me in After Hours at the Armory, and I hope to see you again in another video.